now my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, award-winning author and documentarian Stephen Smith. And as I say, I feel privileged that Stephen and I have gotten to know each other casually in the last several weeks, and he is just a wonderful talent. He is a 4-time Emmy-nominated producer and 16-time Telly Award winner. He has created over 200 documentaries for various media, including the networks AMC, TCM, History Channel, A&E, National Geographic, and Bravo. A former supervising producer of the TV series A&E Biography and AMC Backstory. His project collaborators include some names, needless to say, titans of the industry, such as George Lucas, Steven Spielberg, Martin Scorsese, Julie Andrews, Sidney Poitier, and Stephen Sondheim. He is the author of books, A Heart at Fire Center, The Life and Music of Bernard Herrmann, and music by Max Steiner, The Epic Life of Hollywood's most influential composer. Both received the ASCAP Foundation Deems-Taylor Virgil Thompson Award for Excellence. Please help me to welcome to the stage Stephen C. Smith. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Ted, for such a nice introduction. And thank all of you for coming here today. I am just curious, this is the second of a 3-part series. How many people are here for the first time in this series? We're not able to come last week. Oh, great. So maybe there was some good word of mouth. Well, I hope you enjoy this, and I hope that you will return next week for the final in our 3 Hitchcock talks, the Hitchcock Blonde and One Brunette. But I want to say, because I heard someone wondering, did they need to attend the previous one? Do they need to come next week for this to make sense? Absolutely not. I created these so they are standalone. You can watch 1 or 2 or 3, and hopefully they will sort of complement each other with different information so that when I circle back to certain movies that we talked about last week, you will be seeing different clips and hearing about them from a different perspective. And I should say, there will be a few movie spoilers, but I don't think it's going to spoil the movies. And as you can see, and that is a real album, our topic today is Hitchcock and music. And I think that music, you as Ted was so kind enough to mention, I've written a couple of books on film music, and I continue to think that music is perhaps the most essential, underappreciated element in film. But there's going to be plenty of Hitchcock, I promise, in this. So where to begin in our discussion? Well, let us start by traveling back in time to 1959, to the Universal Studios backlot, where the filming of Psycho has just wrapped. And yes, there they are, building the Bates home. This was by far the riskiest film of Alfred Hitchcock's career. He had a lot on the line with this movie because he put his own money into making it, because Paramount Pictures was not terribly enthused in 1959 about making, spoiler alert, a movie about a cross-dressing serial killer. That is not the kind of movie you went to see in the 1950s. You saw elegantly dressed people like Cary Grant and others, especially in a Hitchcock film, doing stylish things as he had done just in the previous months with North by Northwest. So Hitchcock was doing something very, very different, far grittier and far, far edgier. Well, as the film was taking shape, before it had any music, he had a private screening of Psycho for several of the people involved, including its screenwriter, a young man named Joseph Stefano. And Joseph Stefano watched the film, and as he later said, the movie, quote, looked awful. I came out sick. It was long. It had no tension. Well, Hitchcock tried to reassure him that it was just a rough cut, dear boy, don't worry. But he was kind of concealing some concerns on his own, because by the time Hitchcock showed Psycho to his composer, Bernard Herrmann, who had been his partner by this time on 5 previous films, Hitchcock admitted that he too was feeling anxious. To quote Bernard Herrmann, who said this years later, Hitch was nervously pacing back and forth, saying it was awful and that he was going to cut it down for his television show. He was crazy. He didn't know what he had. Wait a minute, I said. I have some ideas. Well, according to Herrmann, Hitchcock said, fine, go ahead, do what you want, but just do not write any music for the shower scene. Well, Benny did something he did often. He ignored him, and he wrote music for the shower scene. And after he recorded it, when they were actually mixing all the sound together in the film, he was sitting by Hitchcock, and he said, you know, Hitch, I did write music for the shower scene, and of course you don't have to use it, but may I play it for you? Would you just listen to it? So let's hear that cue, accompanied not by the film, but by the original storyboards that Hitchcock used for the scene's filming. And you'll also hear some remarks about it from the French director Claude Chabrol.
C'est comme des violons aigus, c'est comme des cris d'oiseaux. Et comme Norman est empailleur d'oiseaux, je veux dire, c'est presque le coupable qui est désigné.
Well, how effective was that music cue? It was so effective that it is impossible to count the number of times it has been imitated or parodied since 1960. I heard it in an M&M's commercial recently. That's not my favorite, though. I think this is probably my favorite homage. I love that they not only copied the shots exactly, but the composer Alf Clausen used the exact arrangement of Bernard Herrmann's, essentially. Well, not only is the shower scene the most famous sequence in all of Alfred Hitchcock's career, I think that the story of its making gives us a lot of insight into how Hitchcock used sound and music in films. After Bernard Herrmann played him that music cue, Hitchcock was smart enough to realize that the shower scene did work better with music. But throughout his career, the director's preference was to use music sparingly. He thought of it as an element of sound as much as a tool for manipulating emotion. And Hitchcock knew how effective a scene could be without music, or if it only had what's called source music in the business. Now, source music simply refers to the music that the characters in the story are hearing. And Hitchcock especially enjoyed using source music that was, as he called it, giggly, light music as counterpoint for something really terrible happening on the screen. And here's my favorite example of that from his 1951 thriller, Strangers on a Train.
I don't think I feel too much like running.
Oh, wait a minute, wait for me.
Let's not break a leg. Yeah, we got this for you later. Is your name Miriam?
Right here. How did you...
Well, When Hitchcock was making his first sound films in the 1930s in Britain, he kept musical underscoring to a minimum. But music does play an important part in those movies because Hitchcock often used music as a plot point in his stories. For example, in the film The Lady Vanishes, a British spy, played by Dame May Whitty, is carrying a secret message that has been encoded in a phrase of music that cannot be forgotten, or the message is lost. In 1934's The Man Who Knew Too Much, a concert at London's famous Albert Hall is the setting for an assassination plot. A professional killer plans to fire a fatal bullet into a diplomat at the moment when cymbals crash at the climax of a concert piece. Hitchcock himself enjoyed symphonic music, but like most people, he couldn't describe music technically, and he really didn't need to, because when composers and directors work together, it's far more important that they can talk to each other about the intention of the music, not about how it's written exactly. That said, I do think that Hitchcock was something of a musician because he understood the tempo and the dynamics, the highs and the lows of storytelling better than any other director. And he often described his approach to filmmaking by using musical metaphors. He once said about his camera technique, "It is essential that you know ahead of time something of the orchestration. In other words, image size. What I mean is, take the close-up. Well, that's like music. The brass sounding brassy. Sometimes you see films edited such that the close-up comes in early, loud sound before you need it. And by the time you really need it, it has lost its effect because you have used it already." Here are two other brief instances of Hitchcock using music as a filmmaking metaphor.
Everything is decided on paper. I do not improvise while the picture is being made. A little bit is permissible. But if you don't make your picture on paper ahead of time with all the desired effects, if you cannot visualize or hear, then this would be like a musician composing with a full orchestra in front of him. So he's got his blank music and saying, "Flute, give me a note, will you please?" And the flute gives him, "Thank you very much," and he writes it down.
He said, "Ernie, what we're doing is we're sitting at an organ and we're pressing this chord, which makes an audience go, ooh. And then we press this chord, which makes them laugh. And we're just playing on them." And he said, "Someday we won't need the movie."
Anticipating virtual reality, I guess, perhaps. Well, when Hitchcock came to America for the first time to work, he was working under the rather heavy hand of producer David O. Selznick. And when it came to scoring their films, Selznick pretty much ignored Hitchcock's ideas in favor of his own. For example, in 1945, Selznick hired Hungarian composer Miklos Rózsa to write music that would give the movie Spellbound an intensely romantic feeling. And Rózsa, a very fine composer who would later give us Ben-Hur and many other great scores, he really delivered. He wrote a memorable love theme, and he won the Academy Award for Spellbound. Here is a little of that music from the film.
It doesn't happen like that. In a day.
It happens in a moment sometimes. I felt it this afternoon. It was like lightning striking. It strikes real.
Understand how it happened.
Well, Hitchcock hated that score. It was exactly the opposite of what he had wanted to do in the film in terms of where the music was placed and what it would sound like. I know Miklos Rózsa was very disappointed that he never got a call from Hitchcock after winning the Oscar, and just as well Hitchcock didn't call him. It wasn't until the 1950s, when Hitch served as his own producer, that he became much more involved in the scoring of his movies. And that brings us to what I consider the greatest collaboration between a director and composer in film history.
Obviously, you think very highly of the work of Bernard Herrmann.
I certainly do.
He's been involved as composer and conductor of the music in so many of your recent films. How do you and Mr. Herrmann go about examining the contribution of music to a film?
Well, I don't know, as far as I'm concerned, he does as he likes.
I'm brought in at the very beginning of the idea of the film. And by the time it has gone through all its stages of being written and rewritten and the final process of photographing it, I'm so much part of the whole thing that we've all begun to think one way.
You can learn a lot about how Bernard Herrmann approached film from the music that we heard earlier from Psycho. The entire Psycho score was written for an orchestra made up only of strings. And that's because Herrmann always created a unique orchestration to suit the specific needs of each movie that he worked on. The color of the music was as appropriate as the notes. Psycho was the first and only time that Herrmann limited himself on a film to a string orchestra. No brass, no woodwinds, no percussion. He later said that he wanted a black and white sound to match the black and white photography. And I just think that's brilliant, because when you think about black and white, it has, an infinite number of shades of gray within it, just as the string orchestra, when you combine cellos, violins, violas, double basses, and have them strike or pluck or do different kinds of things, can create an infinite number of sounds. Well, why was Herrmann such a master at capturing tension in music? I think it's because he lived a lot of his life in a state of tension. He was an incredibly sensitive person, sensitive in the sense of understanding emotions like anxiety and romantic passion and being able to translate them brilliantly into music. But he was also overly sensitive to any perceived slight from someone. He would often explode into volcanic rages that could clear a room or end a dinner party, especially with people in the business who he thought were more interested in making money than being creative. That said, Herrmann could also be gentle and loving. He adored animals. This is his dog, Twi, so named because he was scoring a Twilight Zone episode, and she turned up on the back lot, it is said. He was incredibly knowledgeable, not only about music, but about art, poetry, literature, and that gave him a lot in common with Hitchcock. And since Herrmann is a key figure in our talk today, not the only one, but an important one, here's a little more background on him. He was born in New York City in 1911, and from his childhood on, he identified with outsiders and iconoclasts, people who were originals. He skipped school classes to hang out with George Gershwin or to sneak into New York Philharmonic rehearsals to watch Arturo Toscanini conduct and berate his musicians. In 1933, at age 22, Benny, as his friends called him, began working at CBS Radio, a time when radio was a new medium. And Herrmann later said that he learned how to be a film composer by scoring thousands of radio dramas. While he was at CBS, he met another brilliant young talent, this gentleman, Orson Welles. And in 1938, they created the most imaginative radio series of its time. That would be the Mercury Theater on the Air, and happily, most of their broadcasts survive. One of those broadcasts, The War of the Worlds, became an international sensation because Wells presented the story of a Martian invasion as if it was really happening that night in America, and some people thought it was. The show was so talked about that it inspired RKO Studios to invite Orson Welles to come to Hollywood and basically make any film he wanted to. That film turned out to be Citizen Kane. And Orson insisted that his 29-year-old radio composer, who had never worked in film, write that score. Well, Bernard Herrmann certainly rose to the challenge, and he earned an Oscar nomination for Citizen Kane, his very first film score. It did not win, because the 1941 Oscar for score went to Bernard Herrmann for his second film score, for the supernatural fantasy All That Money Can Buy, a wonderful movie better known now as The Devil and Daniel Webster. Well, during the 1940s, Herman remained in New York. He conducted the CBS Symphony and concert programs that he organized. He scored radio dramas, and he came to Hollywood only when a particular project appealed to him. Movies like Wells's The Magnificent Ambersons, or Jane Eyre, or the wonderful romantic fantasy The Ghost and Mrs. Muir, all of which had elements that were dark and brooding, or romantic, or all of the above. But by the end of the 1940s, Benny's life was in turmoil. Radio drama was being replaced by the new medium of television. The CBS Symphony was disbanded, which really devastated him because he had hoped that his main career would be as a concert hall conductor, with composing for film a secondary line of work, something he enjoyed doing very much, but he loved conducting even more. His first marriage collapsed, and in 1951 he resettled in Los Angeles, where he focused on writing scores for film. In 1955, he embarked on what proved to be the greatest and longest collaboration of his film career, and it was, of course, with Alfred Hitchcock. And I love this photo. I think it's staged, but it does capture a real thing, which was how easily Benny could take cat naps, because he didn't get many hours of sleep overnight. He was a very early morning composer. I know his daughter Taffy told me that she never even saw him compose, because by the time she was up on her visits, he was done for the day usually. So what made the Hitchcock-Herman partnership so successful? Well, Hitchcock was, of course, the master of suspense, and Herman was the master of conveying emotion and character psychology in music. Creatively, they melded, and personally, they became friends very quickly. Here's Benny talking about how they worked together.
Hitchcock is an extraordinarily well-organized man in making of his films. The actual shooting process to him is already boring because he has made the film in his head. For example, he will never give an actor direction how to walk in and out of a room. He will accept the fact that the man had to walk into the room, and if that actor walks that way, and it's done with conviction, he's quite happy with it. And so to work with him with music also is a great deal that way. He will say, "I have left reel 3 for you."
Their partnership lasted for 8 films, and let's hear some music from the first. It's 1955's The Trouble with Harry, and as those of you who were with me last week heard, it's about a rather troublesome corpse that keeps popping up in this lovely little town in Vermont. Benny later said that the score was a description of Hitchcock himself, which I think you can hear in this music for the main title and the first scene. Well, when Hitchcock heard that score being recorded, he just beamed because he knew he had found the musical voice for his films. And incidentally, that was his favorite of all of the scores that Herman wrote for him because he loved the way he incorporated humor into the music. Well, you can also tell how thrilled Hitchcock was with this score if you look at their next film together, which was shot almost immediately thereafter. The Man Who Knew Too Much was a lavish remake of Hitchcock's 1934 film that I mentioned earlier. As in the original, a political assassination is going to take place in a concert hall when the cymbals crash at the music's climax. The concert venue was London's Albert Hall, and to play the on-camera conductor, Hitchcock chose someone who actually conducted a series of concerts that year with the London Symphony. That conductor was Bernard Herrmann. We even see his name, as you see, in a poster outside the Albert Hall. That's a shot from the film. And I was just at the Academy Library a couple of days ago, and I looked at the script of the film, and it even mentions that Bernard Herrmann is the conductor. So it just shows how quickly Hitchcock adopted Benny into the very intimate circle of filmmakers that he had. Well, let's see some of this sequence from The Man Who Knew Too Much. As you may recall Doris Day plays a woman whose young son has been kidnapped by would-be assassins. Her husband is Jimmy Stewart. She knows what's going to happen at that concert, but she is terrified to stop it because of her son's kidnapping. And notice how Hitchcock does not need a single line of dialogue in this sequence. It is all image and music. That music being the cantata Storm Clouds, composed by Arthur Benjamin for the original version of the film, but this time conducted by and featuring Bernard Herrmann. Yeah. Oh. Gosh, I'm so glad you enjoyed that. I wish we could all just get together and now watch the rest of the movie together. It's really entertaining. And those concert goers certainly got their money's worth, I would say. As did Benny. He had a wonderful time. They had the best time shooting that sequence. And I admit that I was tricked for years. They did shoot it in the Albert Hall, but anytime it's one of the close-ups or other shots or some of the booths, they did that back at Paramount. And I think it's an absolutely seamless blend because he copied the details of the Albert Hall to the smallest bolt, I think. Well, in 1958, Herrmann and Hitchcock collaborated on a film that was destined to be among their most famous, Vertigo. And it is the first of what many consider 3 back-to-back Hitchcock-Herrmann masterpieces. And we know what we're in for right from the main title of this film, which Benny often called the prelude. That was what he would call the main title. There's a lovely little piece of music playing out there. Herrmann liked to say that the music during a movie's opening titles should tell you what the film is about, and that is certainly true in this case. Because in this music, with help from Saul Bass's visuals, Herrmann tells us that the vertigo in this story isn't just a fear of heights, it is also an emotional vertigo. The movie's prelude, which you're about to hear a little of, is based on a triplet pattern, and that simply means that it's a 1-2-3, 1-2-3 kind of pattern. Its themes in this main title consist of very short phrases that repeat, and in music, short phrases that repeat are called ostinatos, and that is a word you will find next to Bernard Herrmann's name very often because he was the king of writing ostinatos, not merely for the sake of repeating something, but he had a genius for taking phrases that repeated and varying them, whether it was through the orchestration or the tempo and creating a build. There's so many great examples of that, including, I think, one coming up. And I think the effect is, in this case, hypnotic. It makes us feel like we're getting pulled into a whirlpool that is both beautiful and frightening, perfect for a story about obsession. Listen to how Herrmann suggests height and the act of falling by contrasting very high sounds in the strings and woodwinds with forceful chords for muted trumpets and low brass. And through it all, there is the unchanging, hypnotic triplet figure played by harp. Here is an excerpt from the prelude of Vertigo. Those low woodwinds, that's a very Herrmann sound as well. For Hitchcock, Vertigo was the ultimate chance to explore many of his favorite ideas, romantic obsession, the irrationality of passion, something that both Hitchcock and Herrmann knew something about. And those ideas culminate in the sequence you're about to see, which Herrmann called Scène d'amour, scene of love. A reminder that in the story, private investigator Scotty Ferguson, played by James Stewart, has just watched the apparent death from falling of the woman he loves, Madeline, played by Kim Novak. Well, sometime later, Scotty meets a woman named Judy, who appears to be Madeline's double, and he convinces Judy to change her look, the color of her hair, her dress style, to become Madeline. In this clip from the love scene, there isn't a line of dialogue. As Hitchcock told Herman, "We'll just have the camera and you." And one last note on it. One thing that makes Bernard Herrmann sound really special, something that sort of made me know growing up listening to whether the music I was hearing was by Herrmann or not, was that he frequently, almost always, puts mutes on the strings. And we think of mutes in a trumpet, and we know kind of what that sounds like in jazz and others. But the sound of a muted violin or viola has, it suppresses the emotion just a little bit, and the players have to play a little harder to get the emotion out. So there's this wonderful kind of tension between the instrument being tamped down just a bit and the passion of the players, and I think you'll hear it in some of this cue. So here's the scene from Vertigo. Quite a shot, isn't it? As you probably noticed, once the kiss begins, it's one continuous 360 take, which was very unusual for the time and very complicated to do. They had Kim Novak and Jimmy Stewart on a platform and this revolving set around them, and when it changes to another place, he's remembering a part earlier in the story. So again, Hitchcock doing really extraordinary things. That movie, which Hitchcock really put so much of his heart and soul into, as did Benny, was not all that successful when it came out. And Paramount all but implored Hitchcock to please not use the title Vertigo. They said, please call it anything else. People don't know what Vertigo is. And as Herman later said, people in America thought Vertigo meant a backache or something. He could be sort of crotchety funny. And interestingly, when Herman wrote the score, as you heard earlier, he would sometimes come to the set. He'd be involved in the whole production. But he later said that when he wrote that score, he thought of an actor other than James Stewart because he didn't buy Jimmy Stewart's performance. I do. I know a lot of people don't, but Benny couldn't believe that Stewart could be that romantically obsessed. And part of the, I think, effectiveness of the film is for the first, at least half of it, he is the Jimmy Stewart type we know, and then we see him descend more and more into obsession and possibly madness as this takes over. He was a wonderful actor, but I thought it was interesting that in this case, Herman was picturing someone else as he wrote the music. Well, and just one last thought on that, because I love this quote. Herman once said of another score of his that the music contained two distinct elements, romance and tension. They usually go hand in hand. Well, that's certainly true of that music, and let's move on to a lighter collaboration. Not only, oh, not that one, but this one, and even in French from its Belgian poster, I bet you know what it is. Yes, North by Northwest. Not only did Bernard Herrmann write the score for North by Northwest, he is arguably also the reason that this movie happened, because it was Benny who introduced Hitch to a friend of his, a screenwriter named Ernest Lehman, who would go on to write The Sound of Music. He'd already done the adaptation of The King and I, co-wrote Sweet Smell of Success, really one of the finest screenwriters of all time. But it was Benny who introduced Hitch to Ernest Lehman. And Lehman and Hitchcock decided to collaborate on a project for MGM that the studio had chosen, and they realized that this was actually not going to be a very good movie. They weren't excited about it. So they started talking about another movie and what would they like to do. And they decided that they would like to do the ultimate Hitchcock wrong man chase film. And Hitchcock had all these ideas stored up that he'd never been able to put into a movie, and this was the one he could put it into. And Ernest Lehman said, but Hitch, won't MGM be upset when they tell them we're doing this movie that we're just making up out of our heads now instead of the one that they bought and paid for? And Hitchcock said, oh no, dear boy, we'll tell them that we're giving them 2 movies and we'll do that one next. So Hitchcock was very savvy about getting what he wanted. And Ernest Lehman, by the way, once gave me a terrific description of Bernard Herrmann. He said that Benny was, quote, very likable, very irritable, exceedingly iconoclastic, and a somewhat unappreciated pussycat. Again, the score for North by Northwest is not based on long melodies, the kind we might hear from somebody like Henry Mancini or Max Steiner, composers who were great at writing those long melodies that became popular songs sometimes. In this case, the music is largely driven by a rhythm, because Herrmann's main theme is inspired by a Spanish dance form, the fandango. Well, someone at MGM in the music department heard this idea, maybe heard the music, and said, you know, Benny, the movie starts in New York City, and normally when you show New York, you hear music that sounds kind of like Gershwin, so don't you think the music should sound kind of Gershwin-y? And Herrmann very seriously looked at him, probably got an inch or two taller, and said, this movie is not about New York. It is about the crazy dance between Cary Grant and the world. Again, you know, just such a brilliant idea. And Grant, who had begun his career as an acrobat in Britain, you know, is such a physical actor and moves so deftly. He almost dances his way through this movie. And that's what Benny picked up on. And he wrote this wonderful score that has a certain ferocity and also wit at the same time. So here is that memorable main title theme. We'll hear it introduced in the main title, and then we'll hear a little of it from the famous climax that we saw some of, a different part of, last week, the chase on the face of Mount Rushmore. You'll have to see what happens after that on your own. And that brings us to the third film in that trilogy of Hitchcock-Herman classics. Yes, 1960s Psycho, which I've already talked about. But I will say that one of the things Herman does in this score that still astonishes me, and something he did throughout his career, is he takes us inside the minds of the characters with so few notes. You wouldn't think it was possible, but he really does take us inside and make us feel what the characters are feeling. And let's see an example of that. Marion Crane, played by Janet Leigh, whose daughter, you may have noticed, won an Academy Award last night. Good for her. Marion Crane has decided to steal $40,000 from her office job in Phoenix and join her boyfriend in California. That decision takes her out of a world of safety and towards the Bates Motel. Here's a clip with commentary by Paul Hirsch, an Oscar-winning editor who would work with Bernard Herrmann many years later. And you will also hear at the end of this the voice of Herrmann himself, rather late in his life, talking about the scene.
I was home one night and Psycho was on, and I saw a scene in which Janet Leigh had stolen some money. The scene consisted of 3 very simple shots. There was a close-up of her driving, there was a point of view of the road in front of her, and there was a point of view of the police car behind her reflected in the rearview mirror. The material was so simple, and yet the scene was absolutely gripping. And I reached over and I turned off the sound to the television set, and I realized that the extreme emotional duress I was experiencing was due almost entirely to the music.
What you actually saw was a very good-looking girl driving a car. Could have been to the supermarket. And it said to me, well, put voices occasionally. They're missing the money now. I said, that's all right, but that still doesn't make it terrible. And that's when we both agreed the idea we'll bring back some music, which gives the audience something terrible is going to happen to this girl. It's got to.
Every time I hear him say, it's got to, I mean, I think that's the essence of what set Bernard Herrmann apart, is that he completely immersed himself in these characters, in these stories. Even when he didn't like a movie, he found a way to emotionally connect with them, and I think that's part of his genius. Well, Psycho was not just a hit, it was a blockbuster, to the astonishment of everyone involved in it. It was the greatest financial success of Alfred Hitchcock's career. And starting in 1963, Benny also began scoring some episodes of Hitchcock's very popular television series. And some of those shows were written by their mutual friend, who we see here on the left. Does anyone recognize who that might be? It is Ray Bradbury. Yes, and it's interesting. Ray Bradbury they loved him, they loved his work, the people who worked on The Twilight Zone, but they were very unsuccessful in adapting his work. And Ray Bradbury had a great deal of success writing for the Hitchcock TV series, both having other people adapt his stories and have him write scripts for it. So you'll find that he wrote an impressive number of them, and he and Hitchcock almost worked together on a feature, but that's another story for another time. And I'm lucky because he and Benny were very good friends, and I got to spend a good amount of time with Bradbury, who just had wonderful stories that I put in my book about Mr. Herrmann. Well, getting back to the television series, it amazes me that Hitchcock was able to supervise roughly 400 episodes of that series over a decade while releasing up to a movie a year. I mean, boy, he was very organized. Well, this was really a peak period for Hitchcock and Herrmann creatively, but once again, there was a lot of tension in the composer's life. His second wife left him. She just could not tolerate his outbursts anymore. And the movie business was changing. It was catering to a younger audience. Executives wanted scores with a pop song feel or rock and roll. Hitchcock's latest film, Marnie, had been a commercial and critical flop, and he was being encouraged by studio executives to use a younger, more commercially viable composer than Bernard Herrmann, who wasn't exactly the easiest person to deal with in the front office. And that brings us to Torn Curtain, a Cold War thriller Hitchcock directed and released in 1966. How could it go wrong? Paul Newman, Julie Andrews, Hitchcock. Well, unfortunately, it did. Hitchcock's heart just really wasn't in this, and he knew by the time that the shooting was completed that it just wasn't as good as he wanted it to be. And there was a lot of pressure put on him to give the film a commercially exploitable soundtrack to perhaps help sell some records at least, and maybe make the movie more attractive to a young audience. Well, Hitchcock so admired Bernard Herrmann's work that he asked Herrmann to score Torn Curtain, but he made it clear this time he wanted something different. He wrote a very long telegram to Herrmann, who was in London at the time, and Hitchcock said that he wanted a quote-unquote beat score with vigorous rhythm and a change from the old pattern. Well, he wanted a lighter sound from the film. I think he wanted something that perhaps Henry Mancini might have delivered, or perhaps John Barry in the Bond films that were just starting at that time, but certainly something light. And Herrmann thought that this was completely wrong for a movie set in Soviet-controlled countries that was very gray and very dark. And Herrmann thought that the reason the movie wasn't playing was because it needed just more of that kind of mood, that intensity and texture that he was so good at bringing to a film. So he did write a score with vigorous rhythm, but it was less like the Beatles and more like Shostakovich. And even though Hitchcock was kind of on the fence about having music for his big murder scene, again, Benny decided to score it in a very, very big way. So after getting those instructions 2 or 3 times from Hitchcock, Herrmann went off, wrote his score, and then in March of 1966, he was on the soundstage at the Samuel Goldwyn stage in Los Angeles as he began the first recording session for Torn Curtain. He had recorded several cues with the orchestra when Hitchcock arrived. And to say that the director was unhappy with what he heard is an understatement. It was not light music, and he fired Herrmann on the spot. He sent the musicians home, and after 11 years of close friendship and collaboration, they never worked together again. Benny got him on the phone once, and Hitchcock, and I have to say, I understand as a producer, Hitchcock's point of view, was so furious that he had not been given what he received, and Herrmann said, "Don't listen to those other people, do what's right for the movie." Well, click, that was it. And Hitchcock replaced Herrmann on Torn Curtain with a British composer named John Addison, who was best known for his playful Oscar-winning score for the comedy Tom Jones. And we would think of him today as the composer of that delightful, catchy tune for Murder, She Wrote, the opening main title theme. He really used the harpsichord well and wrote a lot of light music. And Hitchcock definitely wanted light music, although perhaps as you've seen from those clips, not a light movie. Well, Addison followed Hitchcock's instructions to the letter. He wrote light, romantic music for the film, and it is not Addison's fault that the score didn't do much for the movie. Torn Curtain did prove to be a critical and commercial disappointment. By the time of its release, Bernard Herrmann had alienated so many people in Hollywood that he was now virtually unemployable in the industry. All his life, he had been a tremendous Anglophile, and he decided finally to move to London. And there, he recorded several albums of his film music, and he did score movies, but they tended to be kind of imitation Hitchcock films, subpar thrillers. And that brings us, although we do have another part 3 next week about the Hitchcock Blonde, so please come back. But I will wrap up the stories of Herrmann and Hitchcock in relation to each other and how they spent their last years here. Let's start with Hitchcock. The director never really found another musical partner the way he had done with, the way he had for so many years with Bernard Herrmann, although 2 of his last 3 films do have, I think, effective scores. For 1972's Frenzy, Hitchcock told composer Ron Goodwin to score the main titles with an upbeat, celebratory overture as the camera glides over London's Thames River. And this is actually, and I think, an effective musical decoy, because the movie that follows quickly becomes one of Hitchcock's darkest. Here is the main title and a little of that first scene.
All the water above this point will soon be clear of industrial effluent.
Look!
What is it? Creatures that so
It's a woman! It's another necktie murder. What did the police think about it? That's what I'd like to know.
I say, it's not my club tie, is it?
And that's about as light as the movie gets. It gets really, really dark after that. Well, to score what proved to be Hitchcock's final film, 1976's Family Plot, the director chose John Williams. Again, I have to say, how nice to see him at age 91 at the Academy Awards last night. Williams, at this time, was fresh off of a little movie you may have seen called Jaws. And of course, that movie had given his career an exciting new trajectory. Now, at first, and I had the privilege of interviewing John Williams for my book on Bernard Herrmann, and he told me that he was reluctant to score Family Plot because Bernard Herrmann was a friend and a mentor to him for many, many years standing. But Benny encouraged John Williams to score the Hitchcock film, and he told Williams, "You'll learn a lot by working with Hitchcock." And John Williams did.
The business of working with Alfred Hitchcock was really very professional and very strong. We had a few meetings as I was writing the music. He didn't ask to hear any of it. I would tell him what I was doing, this or that scene, and we would talk about that. And then the conversation might change to Edward Elgar or some other musical interest of his, you know?
I told you about danger, didn't I? First it makes you sick. Then when you get through it, it makes you very, very loving.
He told me a story about, having nothing to do with Bernard Herrmann, some other composer, I don't know, on a film that he made about a murder. And he instructed the composer to make the music light. So he said he went to London to record the music, and this composer had every double bass and bassoon and timpani and every instrument in the city of London capable of making an ominous, lugubrious sound. Just the opposite of what he wanted. So I said to him, "Mr. Hitchcock, seems like for a murder that's very appropriate."
Look, put that thing away.
And I always quote him because I remember his words exactly. He said, "Mr. Williams, murder can be fun." So he had this idea of irony and many sides to the prism of what one sees.
I feel a holding back. What's the trouble, Henry?
And he did have an idea of having voices. He said, it should be like impressionistic with the women's voices. And I can tell you one little anecdote also about a scene in the film where we didn't have a disagreement about where the music should play, but the discussion. There was a room where the criminal had been, and the camera pans to the window, which is open, and the curtains blow in the breeze, and this reveal of the camera tells us the criminal has escaped.
Good day.
And I continued the music when the camera panned to the window. And he said, if you stop the music when the camera pans to the window, the silence will tell us that it's empty, he's gone, more emphatically, more powerfully than any musical phrase. So he was a wily professional who knew his business and could be of great assistance to a youngster such as I was at that time.
Well, John Williams gave that Hitchcock film, his final one, I think one of its best elements, a witty score that directed the playful side of the director very often. So what were Bernard Herrmann's final years like? Well, sadly, his health wasn't good. And when you look at this picture on the right in particular, you see he's 64 years old here. And I think a lifetime of raging at the forces out there that he saw in opposition had certainly taken their toll on him. However, starting in the 1970s, just after he'd moved to London and seemingly been kicked out of Hollywood, his classic scores for filmmakers like Hitchcock and Wells were being discovered by a new generation of filmmakers. And those directors included Brian De Palma, who we see in the photo on the right in the light suit over Benny's left shoulder. And those filmmakers also included a young Martin Scorsese. In 1975, Scorsese, the film was released in 76, but they made it in 75, Scorsese asked Herrmann to score his new film, Taxi Driver. And because Benny's music for Hitchcock was part of what led Scorsese to hire him, let's hear a little more about this collaboration. This is an interview that I conducted with Scorsese in 1987 for a documentary I'll say a little more about later.
I wanted to make something called like New York Gothic. And I realized the only man who could do the score
with Billy Herman. That's it. There's no one else. I couldn't certainly start with any of the new people. It had to have that feeling of Marnie. It had to have the feeling of Vertigo, of Psycho. I remember him telling me on the phone in Amsterdam, I don't know anything about taxi drivers. I don't want to do a film about that. I said, no, it's not really about a taxi driver. It was called Taxi Driver, but it's about this guy. Yeah, let me send you the script. And I don't know if you can say his score was what I expected. It was Herman's music. It supplied the psychological basis for it throughout. You know, you see Bob looking this way, left to right, but it's the music under that carries, that supports that image. The other big thing about this score, besides the brass and the sense of strength, was the element of jazz. He felt he was starting something new with his work by combining the two. Yeah, and it seemed to really work. Really seemed. I mean, I had a young man in China, in Beijing, 4 years ago, from Mongolia, following me around, asking me what instrument was it? Was it an alto sax or a tenor sax? And then he talked to me about the loneliness of that the music and the film evoked, and how do you deal with the loneliness?
I'm working long hours now, 6 in the afternoon to 6 in the morning, sometimes even 8 in the morning, 6 days a week, sometimes 7 days a week. It's a long hustle, but it keeps me real busy. I can take in $350 a week, sometimes even more when I do it off the meter.
His music is like a vortex. It goes deeper and deeper and deeper. It reminds me of some of Wagner and Tristan and Isolde. It reminds me of some of that. It has a feeling that it never comes to completion, and it starts all over again. Just when you think it's finishing, it starts all over again. It's kind of like a whirlpool and a vortex, emotional one, a psychological one.
In December of 1975, Herman traveled from his home in London back to Los Angeles, a place he had not been to for a long time, to supervise the recording of the score for Taxi Driver. And he was not in good health, but it was a really exciting event. Everyone knew that this was something of an event. And Scorsese got on the phone and called his friend Steven Spielberg and said, you know who's here? Bernard Herrmann. He's conducting right now. And Steven Spielberg stopped whatever he was doing and came over to the recording. And Benny was sitting in a chair. And he had a walking stick at that point to help him. So he's sort of sitting in this chair like George III with this walking stick. And because there were not other chairs in the booth, in this room, everybody who had talked to him had to kneel down to speak to him, which his third wife, Norma, his third wife, Norma, found very amusing. And all these kind of Hollywood greats were sort of kneeling. And one of them was Mr. Spielberg, who came over and said, sincerely, Mr. Herrmann, I love your scores, you're a genius, you're this, you're that. And Benny, being Benny, said, oh yeah, well then why do you always hire Johnny Williams? And it was really a joke because he loved John Williams, was thrilled at his success, but it was kind of your classic, put your money where your mouth is. And Spielberg tells that story and laughs. Well, after the last recording session for Taxi Driver, Benny left the studio. He had a good dinner with friends, he went to sleep, and he never woke up. He was 64 years old. I know, amazing. And just to think that 1976 was the same year that Hitchcock released his last film, although he lived a little longer. Well, normally I would give the last word to Hitchcock, because after all, this is a lecture series about Alfred Hitchcock. But this time I would like to give the last word to Bernard Herrmann, because what he said is so perfect about music in film, certainly applicable to his Hitchcock scores, and I think to movie music in general. In 1945, someone wrote an opinion piece for the New York Times saying that movies should not have underscoring, that film scores were distracting, they were manipulative, you didn't need them. Herrmann read that, and he responded with what remains my favorite article on why film music is often necessary. He wrote, music on the screen can seek out and intensify the inner thoughts of the characters. It can invest a scene with terror, grandeur, gaiety, or misery. It can propel narrative swiftly forward or slow it down. It often lifts mere dialogue into the realm of poetry. Finally, it is the communicating link between the screen and the audience, reaching out and enveloping all into one single experience. And I want to thank you for being part of this single experience as we move on to some, I hope, some questions and answers. But first, I'll just mention briefly, if you want to find out more about Mr. Herman, yes, I wrote a book about him called A Heart at Fire Center. And that was certainly a grand adventure. And I was a consultant and interviewer on this documentary, which was Oscar nominated in 1992, Music for the Movies, Bernard Herrmann, that has a lot of great clips. And with that, thank you so much for listening, and I would love to thank you. And I hope that people have some questions, and they don't have to be on music, they can be on anything, but yes, sir, over here, and I will repeat the questions so that everyone can hear them.
I'm a teacher, I can yell. I'm a film teacher, I'm wearing the Alfred Hitchcock t-shirt that's now getting painted on the back.
Yes, I love it.
And when I did teach the Hitchcock film, they did mention scores. My question is actually on the movie Strangers on a Train.
All right.
When I bought the DVD, it came with 2 DVDs.
Oh, yes.
There's the British cut of
Mm-hmm.
the film. It has a few extra minutes.
Yeah.
You guys know that film.
Yeah.
But there's a scene on the train where it's longer.
Yes.
Where Robert Walker's character is hitting on, it's like a little gay romance.
Yes, yes, thank you. And for those, because this will be seen later by people who sadly, even with your excellent educator's voice, won't be able to hear you. Thank you for mentioning that. Was that was there more you wanted to say in the question?
Did you know that movie?
Yes. Yes, and thank you. He raises a very interesting point. I've often wondered why filmmakers didn't do this often. I guess the answer is studios didn't want to spend the money. But censorship was very restrictive in America from July of 1934 up until the early 60s, when basically the world had changed so much and films from other countries were so explicit that people realized this censorship isn't working, and then they changed in 1968 to the rating system that we still have. Well, in 1951, Hitchcock made Strangers on a Train, based on the first novel by Patricia Highsmith, and it's about 2 men who meet on a train, one of whom is a successful celebrity, and the other is absolutely wacko cuckoo, as seen by Robert Walker in his brilliant performance in the film, playing Bruno, the dangerous one. And Bruno proposes that since they each have someone in their lives that's causing a problem, why don't they swap murders? You kill my person and I'll kill yours, and since we don't know each other, no one will ever put it together. And it's a great premise, and Hitchcock took that premise and adapted it into a film. And what he did, I think, in both cuts of the film is he makes it pretty clear Hitchcock was fascinated by, and I do not in any way, I mean, how do I put this? He was fascinated by things that you couldn't put into movies in the time, let's put it that way. And one of the things you explicitly could not put in movies of the time is homosexuality. And yet, in both versions, he very strongly hints that Bruno is trying to almost seduce the other man, the hero, played by Farley Granger. And at some point, reading the script and seeing the movie, the censor said, "Nah, that's way too much. Just, that's a look too much. Those are lines too many." And Hitchcock was very, very good at manipulating the censors. He was maybe the best ever. I could tell you Psycho stories. Basically he would put in shots and things that he knew they would cut out. So he'd go, all right, I'll cut that out. And of course, there were things he always knew would not make it. And then they managed to allow him to show one of the first shots of a toilet in an American film. In Psycho, you may recall that's how Marion disposes of some paper. She tears it up and flushes it. Well, that's just nothing to us now, but in 1960, that was like, oh my God, what are we seeing? And then 2 minutes later, she's murdered. So yeah, that was for so many reasons, he really pushed that film. Well, going back to Strangers on a Train, Hitchcock, I guess, felt strongly enough he liked those scenes enough that he convinced them to release an alternate director's cut in Britain. And it is just a little bit longer, and it's a little, as you say, a little more explicit about Bruno's attraction to the other man. And it also has a different ending, which I'll just leave to people to see. So that's a very rare case, though, where a director got the chance to release a movie in the less restrictive area of Great Britain. But thank you for asking. Yes, sir?
You mentioned that
Torn Curtain, yes. Well, yes, the gentleman was saying that Hitchcock's break with Herman seemed rather extreme. And I will say part of that is due to my necessary time compression. It was largely due to that because Hitchcock really knew that he had a movie that needed help of a certain kind, that a certain kind of music was expected by the front office. He wanted to keep that front office happy. And he knew how clearly he had made his instructions to Herman, and that Herman had, without question, gone in a different direction. Done it, I must say, fully believing in the film, fully believing that Hitchcock would say, as he had with the shower music, my goodness, you're right, much better, bravo, thank you for doing that. He really believed till that moment that that was what was going to happen, and he was very wrong. But I think that Hitchcock, and this is a topic that we'll have more to say about it in another medium soon, but I was trying to figure out how their relationship evolved, because Hitchcock would sign things love, Hitch, very, very close. But Hitchcock was present when Benny would lose it, and sometimes Benny would lose it when he was conducting these great recording sessions, and he loved the musicians. He, in one movie, not a Hitchcock film, he loved the solo playing of a soloist that he had featured in a score so much that he told the studio, RKO, that Virginia Majewski has to have a credit in the beginning of the film because they didn't have end credits. And the studio said, Mr. Herman, we don't put names of, there's no place in the main credits for the name of a musician. And he says, put her on my card. So he went from having his own solo card to sharing the credit with this musician and a violist, and she was just astonished when she saw the film. So he could be really generous, and yet he could absolutely lose his temper in a way that I think was beyond his control. There are theories about what condition he might have had that caused him to have such a raw inability to control his feelings, but if he just wasn't hearing the very, very specific sound he wanted, he could be very, very difficult. Well, Hitchcock watched some of those sessions, and sometimes if Benny would get upset when they were mixing the sound and he'd get caught up in something almost like a child, Hitchcock would pat him and say, now, Benny. And Hitchcock had, and I found a wonderful letter that Hitchcock wrote one of his disciples, Francois Truffaut, saying, talking about Mr. Herman, yes, but he is a very difficult man, a few years earlier. So Hitch kind of made peace with the fact that there was this side of Herman, because Herman understood Hitchcock, I think, better than any of his collaborators in terms of the emotional sense of what he was trying to achieve. So he gave him latitude, but after a while, Benny just got more and more difficult, and he thought that Hitchcock's bosses were wrong, and Benny had to please them, but please his audience, please himself, and it was an impossible situation. So I think that's what there is to it. John Williams had some interesting comments too, which I can share later when I asked him about it, but thank you for asking. And by the way, I have to say, I at this point now, 3 decades into producing documentaries, I have tremendous empathy for both people on both sides. I know that Herman really wanted to help his friend and make a good film and help it succeed, and Hitchcock was absolutely right in being furious that what he had asked for so much was not what Herman gave him. He wished that Herman had just said, I can't do that, So it's a fascinating situation. And you can hear that score, by the way. Yes, the gentleman near the back. Yes. Did Bernard Herrmann have the film in front of him? Things were much more, as you can imagine, difficult in those days to watch. There wasn't videotape yet. Nowadays composers can and do have on their computers, on their iPhones, the movie with time codes on it, with little markings saying, here's where the sting has to happen when this act of violence happens or whatever. In those days, it was just pure film. So Herman would watch the film. Hitchcock had a private screening room in his very lavish Universal Studios bungalow, and Herman would watch the film, and he would be given, and this goes all the way back to Max Steiner in the early 30s, someone would break down the movie within fractions of seconds as to what was happening, of like this frame, someone starts walking across the room, this frame, someone reaches the end of the room, etc. So the composer generally had to work to those timing sheets, and then they would go back and, if they wanted to, go into the editing room. And Herman loved Hitchcock's editor, a brilliant man who doesn't get enough credit, named George Tomasini. And Herman would watch the film sometimes just with George Tomasini rolling it back and forth and figuring out the timing. But Benny was remarkably quick in his coming up with ideas. And there's a great story. In fact, the very last film of his, second to last film of his that he scored, the last to be released, was a Brian De Palma movie called Obsession. And when Benny was shown the film without music, he started to laugh. And this movie was a thriller. And Brian De Palma was a little worried, and Paul Hirsch, the editor who we saw in that clip, Paul was the editor, he was worried. And he walked over to Benny afterwards and said, "Benny, I noticed you laughed a lot during the movie. Ooh, didn't you like it?" And Benny said, "Oh, I loved it." And then Paul said, "Well, why were you laughing?" And Benny said, "Well, I can hear the music, and you're going to have to wait." And I love that. And so he loved that, and he really did. I mean, he could watch that movie, and there were famous stories of him like walking out of a film, and a director might have thought the film was pretty good, and Herman turned around and said, "Don't worry, I'll fix it." And the director was like, "Okay." And I found memos from Daryl Zanuck, who didn't produce the Hitchcock films, but Herman did a lot of work at 20th Century Fox, and Zanuck pretty much just said, "Tell Bernard Herrmann that was brilliant. He made the movie much better." So Zanuck was one of those very astute executives who appreciated especially the pace of a film. And I know I got to show a little bit of Torn Curtain and a little bit of Psycho without the music, but I'll tell you, if you can watch a movie, a famous movie, without the music, or just do what Paul does and turn the sound off in a reel that doesn't have a lot of dialogue, it will feel very, very long. And when you put music in it, it's just like, oh, that was great. That was, what was that, a minute or two? So thank you for asking. Any other questions from anyone? I will just say again then. Oh, yes, in the very back row. Yes. Music for foreign, yes, he is asking about an early Hitchcock film, Foreign Correspondent, with Joel McRae. Very entertaining, often overlooked movie now, the movie he did right after his first Hollywood film, Rebecca. It's a timely movie made when America was not yet in the war, and Joel McRae plays an American reporter who's sent to Europe to figure out what's going on, and engages in a lot of episodic adventures in different places, much as Cary Grant will later do in North by Northwest. And it was scored in a rather jaunty way by the great Alfred Newman, not Alfred E. Newman of Mad Magazine fame with the gap in his teeth, but a composer who, before John Williams, had the most nominations for composing, the musical director of 20th Century Fox, who scored The Diary of Anne Frank and Airport, many great scores. And so he scored Foreign Correspondent, and it's a light score, the kind that Hitchcock often liked to have. And it's a very entertaining movie, and it's one of those movies like Chaplin's The Great Dictator that managed to make a very strong anti-Nazi statement. Even more than that, a let's get involved in the war before it's too late statement, which Hollywood really didn't want to do and which the censors actually forbade. There was a ruling, there was something in the production code, the censorship, saying that foreign governments could not be mocked or criticized. And people were saying, even when it's Hitler and it's 1940? Really? So those movies got through here and there. So that's Foreign Correspondent. So I know I didn't say much about the music, but I'll say that Alfred Newman served it well, and it's very fun, and I recommend it as a rental. You can probably stream it. And I hope you will come next week when we get into one of the most talked about aspects of Hitchcock's work, the Hitchcock blonde, and his fascination with blondes in his films, which isn't really just about the hair color. It's actually about the leading ladies in his films, and a very, very important woman who was not in his films, but was by far the most important creative force in his life. Find out who that is 1 week from today. And if there's anything else, ask me afterwards. Thank you.